Hey guys, welcome to the latest episode of Physique Science. Today we've got somebody on the podcast who, it's hard to believe that I've never actually had them on the podcast before because I've been friends with him for 10 years, and that's Dr. Dominic D'Agostino. And Dom and I met back in 2007 at the Experimental Biology Conference, where we were both presenting posters there on our research. And we just knew each other from the bodybuilding.com forums and spent time training together, getting to know each other, and we've kind of just continued that relationship throughout the years. And it's been pretty cool to see Dom kind of evolve from a neuroscience guy to being really interested in nutrition. And I remember about 6 or 7 years ago when he started telling me about like what he was doing with the ketogenic diet. And, you know, a lot of people view me as anti-ketogenic, and I'm not anti-ketogenic, actually. I'm just anti-bullshit, as I've talked about a lot. But, you know, I do think that there are some benefits to the ketogenic diet. I think many of them tend to be overstated by ketogenic or low-carb zealots. And so I wanted Dom on because I thought that if I could get on with him, somebody who's perceived as being, you know, really at the forefront of the ketogenic diet movement, if we could get on and have a conversation about what the science actually says about some of this stuff, that it could really clear up a lot of confusion for people. And so I think it's a great podcast. I think it's one of our best. It's almost an hour and a half long, so we definitely squirrel a lot and divert a lot, but there is a ton of information in this. If you guys listen to this whole thing, you're going to learn so much. You'll be shocked. And I really do think, in a way, it's one of our best episodes. And, you know, we definitely, we could have kept talking for another 2 hours. So it was tough to actually cut it off when we did, but I was afraid it was going to turn into a 3-hour podcast if we didn't. So I think it's highly likely we'll have him back on in the future. And, you know, this was a lot of fun for us. So big thanks to Dr. Dominic. And, you know, we really enjoyed having him on, and he's just like the nicest guy. So I hope you guys enjoy this, and if you have any questions, you know, feel free to send us your questions at Layne@biolayne.com, and we'd love to hear from you guys. All right, enjoy the episode, guys. So how's things out in Arizona?
They're going. I just had my my study approved for IRB approved.
Oh wow!
I don't know if I told you, but in June I got flat out rejected. And all the professors were like, "What? How does it even happen?" Because I guess it never happens at ASU, but they rejected me. So I spent 5 months trying to changing everything from a dietary intervention to a freaking survey because I just want to graduate at this point.
Yeah,
and they finally approved me 2 weeks ago. But then I met with one of my other committee members, thesis defense committee members, and she pretty much said that the statistical analyses required is way too advanced beyond what I will ever learn in this program. So she very much encouraged me to simplify my study design. So I'm changing it again. So I just want to bed. But it's a good learning experience. And now I'm realizing, and people kept reminding me, you're not trying to change the world with your master's thesis. This is not the time to be doing that. So
well, who knows? You may still.
I'm hoping this will be the first of several studies, and if I end up just doing a series of surveys, that's fine too, but I'd like to eventually come up with a validated scale to measure some aspects of eating behavior that I'm interested in that are not out there right now. So
have you ever had a study rejected for IRB?
Yeah, I mean, we had 4 IRBs go through.
Yes, I have something that neither of you have. I've never been rejected. Well, it's the IACOOK for animals. But.
Well, not, it bounced back, probably about 7 or 8 times before we got it through.
Wow.
NASA's very risk averse, so they,
Sure. Wow.
And one was just, it was so bad, I was just like, I give up. But we had 5 going in, and we got 4 out of 5 approved.
Oh, that's good.
This year, actually. So.
Yeah, well, I was told Dr. Campbell was telling me that sometimes it takes up to a year to get approval, IRB approval.
Yeah. Easy. Yeah.
Oh, God.
Yeah, depending on the institution.
Yeah, that's why, people don't realize that, from inception to publication, it can be 3 or 4 years.
I didn't realize
much work on an IRB for just a year, and then doing a study for a year,
Absolutely.
and then working up the data for a year, and then publishing for 6 months.
I haven't even started collecting data, and I've gained so much respect for researchers just from going through this. there's so much work involved with designing your protocol, explaining your rationale, and everything.
It took me 10 years, not to worry you, it took me 10 years to get my PhD dissertation research. Well, 9, yeah, published.
Wow.
So
Wow.
I finished my postdoc before it got published, actually.
Oh.
My postdoctoral fellowship. So I was done with that by the time it got published.
Well, my last study in my PhD just got published in the early 2017. So that was 7 years later, you know.
Yeah.
And probably almost 9 years after, 8 or 9 years after I did the actual research. So that's, so kiddies, for those of you listening, if you're into quick gratification, research is not your thing. It's not your thing. And that's
Definitely takes a ton of patience. I'm being tested every day now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I guess that we can go ahead and segue into, we have obviously the legendary Dom D'Agostino here. You like that? Is that he would never call himself that.
I've never heard that my name prefaced like that, so.
So I hit a PR.
That was pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah. There we go. All right. So for those that aren't familiar with Dom, Dom and I have been friends for about 10 years now. We met at experimental biology in 2007, so it's 10 years this past April.
And I'd known you well before that, just online.
Yeah, from the bodybuilding.com forums. We were both on the bodybuilding.com forums. And we just commented before this podcast started that like we were friends before anybody knew anything about either one of us, or cared about our research or what we did. So it's pretty cool to see like how big his name has gotten. And for those who maybe aren't familiar with you, I'll give the intro because you don't like to talk about yourself too much. But he did your PhD's in neuroscience, right?
And physiology.
And physiology. He's a professor at USF, University of South Florida, and he does a lot of research into ketogenic diets, and which we're going to delve into a lot today. But actually, what I wanted to start out with was we do this for pretty much everybody that comes on our podcast. We like to talk about how they got into research, like how did what was that inception for. There's very few people out there that wake up when they're a kid. They're like, I want to do a PhD one day. It's like you're a fireman or you're a police officer or you're a baseball player or whatever. Yeah. So when was the inception of I really like this stuff. I think I'd like to pursue, higher education.
Yeah. So research, I guess to be honest, I was in a nutrition program, my undergrad. So I did biology and nutrition.
Where were you at undergrad?
At Rutgers.
At Rutgers,
yeah. And I kind of got talked out of nutrition, as you know.
Actually, a lot of people consider it a soft science, and especially back in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
When I went to interview at Illinois, my uncle who did his bachelor's in nutrition science and worked his way up to vice president of Meade Johnson at one time.
Yeah.
He said, don't be surprised if you come across a lot of really bitter nutrition professors, because a lot of them are viewed, like especially through like the 70s, 80s, and 90s. As a joke science or a soft science, even though now it's very well regarded as a very important science.
That's surprising.
So
I would
never surprise me that somebody talked you out of it. Yeah.
Well, yeah. If I was kind of, my track was to go to med school, so it was like, well, why don't you just take biology and take more, biochemistry, molecular biology. The best courses and the hardest courses I had, as an undergrad was my nutrition, advanced nutrition 1 and 2, which was like the advanced biochemistry of food and metabolism, and I probably learned more in those classes than anything else. So I was actually, I think it was my junior year, I realized that I needed to get some laboratory experience to look competitive on, for my resume, for my application for medical school. So I did an undergraduate research project, and that was that undergraduate research got me very interested in research, and my mentor at the time, I was kind of pretty impressed with her, and it became, she kind of talked me out of going to med school and actually, pursuing a PhD. So my PhD project was basically understanding the neural control of autonomic regulation, so how the brain controls our physiology. And that's why I majored, really studied neuroscience and physiology. And my PhD research was on looking at the response to low levels of oxygen. And after I finished my PhD, my postdoctoral fellowship was looking at the effects of high levels of oxygen as it pertains to Navy SEAL warfighter, and how to understand it, predict it, prevent it. And part of preventing oxygen toxicity seizures was the ketogenic diet. So I realized clinically the ketogenic diet was used for drug refractory or resistant epilepsy. And then the more I looked into it, it was the most powerful neuroprotective anti-seizure strategy out there. So I directed my research kind of away from drug-based research and more towards nutrition as a metabolic-based therapy that, on paper and the science demonstrated that it was more powerful than any drug out there. So I just wanted to understand it and harness kind of that, and harness metabolism essentially for, the agency that was funding me, which is the Department of Defense and Office of Navy Research.
Wow. Okay, so I have to ask, because I'm a grad student currently, did you go straight from undergrad to grad school to you had no breaks, you just went straight through?
I did, yeah. When I was an undergraduate, I applied to the PhD program, and I took a little bit of time off to study for like the GREs and things like that. And I just kept taking it. There was a subject GRE that was like, molecular biology or biochemistry. So I had to like kind of study to make sure that the requirements to get into the PhD program were just like a little bit higher than the master's. So I kept kind of working until I knew I could at least be competitive on there. And when I got in, I was real happy because I felt like I kind of skipped a step. So that got me, and I was able to sort of parlay my undergraduate research into my PhD research. So I had skills like I knew how to do patch clamp electrophysiology and immunocytochemistry, immunohistochemistry, and animal research and things like that.
Ooh,
as
that tingles
an undergrad. So I had a little bit of an up going in, but yeah, my PhD research was really hard, and it kind of humbled me. And it's a lot of failures before you get things to work. And and that I went into it, pretty pumped that I would just bang it out in 3 years. I was even telling people I'm going to get this done in 3 years. But it took me 5.
5 years, yeah.
It humbled me. It took me 5.
A little bit, yeah. It's
a little less than 5.
I can't imagine Dom not being humble though, just like the way he is. But
yeah, I was excited. I was so
yeah,
excited.
You were,
just like, I'll outwork. I have this outwork mentality. I'll just keep working and get this done really fast.
What you find is work ethic's very important, but you're just like, there's a certain amount of mistakes you're just gonna make. Yeah. And you just gotta get through it. The first 3 years of my PhD was just a wash. I didn't get any data. So convince people to stick that out. I remember talking to Jeremy Lineker, and we were discussing like the state of education in this country, and he was talking about how the education system's a joke. He said, but I'll tell you one thing we still got. Yeah. He said graduate school here is still legit. He's like, there's a reason everybody comes from other countries to go to grad school here. Yeah. And,
for sure, I've certainly noticed a difference in much higher caliber for grad programs. My classmates even in general than like probably the average undergrad population you would come across, because they usually have a very specific reason for being in grad school. Obviously, some of them are there just they don't know what else to do. But in general, like for me, for example, I came back to school to learn stats, to learn how to read research, and so for me, this has a lot more meaning than just getting a degree, an extra degree.
Let me ask you, Sohi, do you feel like you got a lot out of it so far?
Yeah. Yes, it's been I think this is my third semester. This is my second year, third semester. Last semester with classes, and next semester I just have my thesis to work on. And I will say this semester probably has been the most difficult for me in terms of not time-wise, just mentally, the frustrations, the modifying my thesis over and over and not realizing, I should have done this months ago and there's no way I could have known. And the stats class that I'm learning right now, multivariate statistics, I'm learning structural equation modeling and exploratory factor analysis and all these things, and trying to wrap my mind around those concepts and feeling like this is what it's like to feel, dumb. I don't get it. And so in that way, it's been really, really trying. But I also know that this is the stuff that I will use in the future. This is what hopefully I will take back with my own, my fitness career and whatnot. I want to help. My interest is in the psychology of eating behavior, and it's really not well studied. But there are a lot of things we don't understand, especially with intuitive eating and other concepts. So I really want to help expand upon that, and I can't do that without this foundation first. So I'm always trying to tell myself, okay, just this many more weeks, just stick it out, take it one day at a time. But it's definitely it's been a very difficult semester-long test, you can call it, I guess.
And, it's funny, like a lot of people will ask me, I've been coaching people online for 12 years now. And like, did your PhD help you? And I said, yeah, it helped me a lot. But, at no point in a schooling is somebody going to tell you, well, when this client does this, you need to do this. Like you're not going to get that, But what I can tell you is your ability to think critically, analyze research, form educated opinions, and be willing to change your opinion, if you do it right, is going to be unbelievably enhanced. I heard something the other day, and I was telling Andrew and Dom yesterday, I said, be willing to learn something new, change your mind, change what you know, unlearn it, and then relearn it completely differently. I probably butchered the quote, but I feel like that is so true. Like, just what we believe, especially with how fast things are evolving now in science, with AI and computer systems and the processing we can do. It's just mind-boggling. And, one of the other things we talked about yesterday, and I kind of wanted to talk about this too, was some of the greatest things you'll ever come across in science are complete and utter mistakes, or things you didn't expect. Like some of I thought the most interesting stuff from my PhD was the protein synthetic refractoriness, and that was a completely unexpected thing. In fact, I kept running the data over and over because I didn't believe the data, or I didn't want to believe the data because it didn't fit my hypothesis. And Layne was great. He was like, maybe you should stop trying to make the data fit your hypothesis and change your hypothesis to fit the data. Yep. And that was a mind-blowing moment for me.
Yeah.
But actually aspartame. I don't know if you ever heard the story of aspartame. Mm-hmm. So it was a guy who was working on dipeptides, chlorinated dipeptides, and he was reading a book at the same time, licked his fingers to turn the page, and noticed that his fingers tasted sweet, and that's how aspartame started. Yeah.
It's phenylalanine.
It's phenylalanine and aspartic acid with a chlorine on it, I think, on it as well. Yep. Yeah, so that's pretty wild. Just a complete mistake, and now the most popular artificial sweetener there is. Whole industry around it. So you were telling me yesterday you kind of came across ketogenic diet. People, they know you for, I think, is they think of you and they think, okay, ketogenic diet as a therapy for cancer.
Fill in the blank.
Yeah. Or what else? Yeah. But that was kind of come across. Obviously you looked at it for epilepsy for divers.
That was amazing.
But it was kind of by accident that you found that it might have a application to cancer as well. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So to study brain cells under high levels of oxygen pressure to simulate, what would be a Navy SEAL dive, we had to create various technologies to look at cells and even mitochondria in these high pressure oxygen conditions. So we have environmental chambers that are hyperbaric chambers or hypobaric, depending on the chamber. And we installed, part of my postdoctoral fellowship was installing technologies like a microscope inside these to visualize the cells and the cellular and molecular processes and the cell membrane, for example, under these conditions. And part of it was in validating the technology for use in biological samples. An atomic force microscope was put inside, and that was used to characterize materials, but not really biological materials. So I did a wide variety of cells: brain cells, muscle cells, heart cells, skin cells, and I noticed I had a cell line that I didn't really know where it came from. And a colleague had given it to me, and when I was studying these cells, it was interesting. It differed from the other cells because they were overproducing massive amounts of oxygen-free radicals in response to great levels of oxygen. And visually, from using confocal microscopy, I could see that the mitochondria were kind of blowing up and exploding, and it was because of the oxidative stress, and the membranes were starting to degrade through membrane lipid peroxidation. So I delved into, exactly what cell line. I knew it was an immortalized brain cell line. That's all I knew at the time. And there was a wide variety of these types of immortalized cell lines, but it was a U87 MG cell, a glioblastoma cell. So I looked into understanding that it was a cancer cell. I looked into why are cancer cells different, and why are they sensitive to these high levels of oxygen. And that led me, and there's many different reasons for that, but that led me down to the path of kind of studying cancer and using things like high pressure oxygen to reverse tumor hypoxia and to stimulate oxidative stress in cancer cells. And it led me to the understanding that cancer cells have damaged, or I could say dysfunctional mitochondria, in that their mitochondria are not able to effectively metabolize certain energy substrates to generate ATP. And at least in this brain cancer cell line, that was the case. So that led me to doing some pilot studies on ketones and cancer cells in culture. And soon after, I had a student that wanted to do her PhD dissertation project on the ketogenic diet and hyperbaric oxygen combined, and that was around 2010. I formally, started this research and got, ethics approval to do some pilot studies that led to a number of different, projects we have going on in the lab now.
Wow. Okay. So briefly, I know there are a lot of misconceptions, but what is the keto diet? What does it consist of? What makes it different?
So I'll tell you what it's not. First, it's not a high protein diet. It's actually a low protein diet, the classical, clinically based ketogenic diet.
Okay.
I like to kind of approach it in describing it in the context of fasting or not eating, right? When we fast, we liberate, our fat stores from adipose to energize our body when we deplete our glycogen stores. And fat is a very effective fuel for the heart, for the muscles, but not the brain, because these large fatty acids cannot effectively cross the blood-brain barrier. So our brain, through beta oxidation of fatty acids, creates beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, and these are called ketone bodies, and they're very small. I think of them as very small, water-soluble breakdown products of fat metabolism that occur, and they're very, very highly energetic, efficient fuels, and they more or less spill into the bloodstream, and our brain, uses these quite readily as a fuel source. So after fasting for a period of days, your brain switches from glucose metabolism to ketone metabolism. So this was shown back in 1967, originally by work done at Harvard Medical School by Dr. George Cahill. And that sort of changed our whole idea of brain energy metabolism. And I do think, from the context of, as a neuroscientist, I'm very interested in this, but even from the context of dieting, if you elevate ketone bodies, a fuel that your brain can use, even if you're dieting and you have periods of hypoglycemia, which are inevitable if you're calorie restricting, if you create a calorie deficit, and your ketones are elevated, you are resilient and even asymptomatic against hypoglycemia. And that could be something like falling on the floor, or cravings and hunger will be significantly attenuated with ketones. So that's one of the practical advantages there. Oh, you had a question?
No, I can think of like my dad, for example, is hypoglycemic. He's years ago we were hiking up and he just passed out, fell down the mountain about 100 yards from being hypoglycemic. So that's something that maybe him, if he were to.
Yeah, you kind of have to think about, you have, your body has a fuel selector, you can, I don't want to make it sound like it's an on and off switch. For ketones, it kind of is.
It's more like a hybrid.
Yeah, like if you're consuming, like a normal amount of carbohydrate that most people would be, your ketone levels you measure can be pretty minimal.
You're
right?
You're never, unless you eat like a real early dinner that's like a low carb dinner. Like most people, we've done hundreds of thousands of ketone measurements, and on mice and people, it's really rare to find someone in a state of ketosis. You know,
But
they
even
have
like,
to fast.
do they register like a lower level of ketones? Like, is there like, or is
Yeah.
it like almost non-existent in the blood if they're eating a certain amount of carbohydrate?
It's always there, but it's not what I would say a significant contributor
to
to
energy.
brain. Yeah, you
Yeah.
have to really not like go without food for at least a day, and without carbohydrates for 2 or 3 days to really start getting your ketone levels elevated.
Okay, so you have to think about like you have kind of, I mean, there's more fuels than this, but I'm paraphrasing. You have, and even with ketones, it's still part of fat metabolism.
Yeah.
It's kind of a less used portion of fat metabolism, but you have glucose metabolism. You can which obviously a lot of people are familiar with how you can get energy from that. You have fat metabolism. Those two kind of go on a sliding scale. The more glucose metabolism you have going on, the less fat metabolism you'll have going on, and vice versa. Yeah, it's not quite that simple, but typically you have both going on at the same time in terms of using both for fuel. If you have a high carbohydrate diet, and it makes sense from a teleological perspective. You eat more carbohydrate, you're going to burn more carbohydrate.
Yeah, you burn what you eat. Yeah.
Right, exactly, and that's you're just adapting your body to that. Now, a lot of people will incorrectly take that and say, well, if you not incorrectly, but they go too far with it, and we discussed this, but well, if you want to burn more fat, you use more fat for fuel. Well, you will burn more fat, but you're also consuming more fat, so you can also store more fat. Carbohydrate, yes, there is de novo lipogenesis, but there's studies to show that the contribution towards total fat content of stored body fat is really, really small from de novo lipogenesis, from carbohydrate to adipose. Now, that being said, I think if you were eating like very low fat, very high carb, and still on a calorie surplus, your body would probably get more able to store that. But point being is that, well, how would you get fat on a high carb diet then if it's not really converting much from carbohydrate to fat, to body fat? Well, the fat you eat now has no reason to be oxidized, and you can store much more of it, right?
Yeah.
The flip side, if you're eating a lot of fat, you're burning a ton of fat, but you're also storing more fat.
Yep.
So, the net thing comes down to calories.
It's absolutely calories, which is.
Did y'all hear that? Did you hear that?
Calories matter?
It's not acknowledged enough in the low carb ketogenic diet community that calories are really kind of like the most important thing, right? So the way for me and for many people who are proponents of the ketogenic diet and things like intermittent fasting and carbohydrate restriction, and ketogenic diet kind of all lumped together are very effective ways to create a calorie deficit for some people. Time restricted eating for an 8-hour period and fasting a 16-hour period. Like yesterday, I did or the day before yesterday, I did intermittent fasting.
Me too.
Yeah.
I didn't eat for like 9 hours straight yesterday,
and
so I was
felt great.
fasting.
He was like super sharp and everything too. So I was like, "Could you intermittent fasted?" But yeah, some days actually, I acknowledge that I actually feel. I don't know if it's a little bit like calmer and sharper at the same time than if I eat, my typical breakfast, which is, kind of a keto breakfast, like eggs and maybe some fish or some greens and things like that. I just feel a little bit sharper usually. So kind of when I want to be my best, but then if I know I'm going to work out like later in the day, I know it's important to get a little bit of calories in just because I feel, I have a little more drive in the gym. When I do that, but it varies. It varies considerably. But the thing is that if you are using to create body composition alterations and changes, typically losing fat, you have to create a calorie deficit. And for some people, it's hard to do if on a carbohydrate-based diet, I find. And some people just find mentally they do a little bit better on a ketogenic diet or low-carb diet. And ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting is actually a lot easier if you do the ketogenic diet because
keto coupled with intermittent fasting.
Yeah, because you're quote unquote a little bit more fat adapted.
Now, if you just do carb backloading and veganism somewhere in there, now you will cover and paleo. You would cover the gamut of everything that would make us clickbaity as hell. And get this podcast in the top 1%. No, I mean that's a very good perspective and something that I think is lost. I mean, like a lot of people will keep tweeting at me about Joe Rogan and get Layne on the Joe Rogan podcast, and because a lot of people want to blame it on sugar or this and that, And, the fact of the matter is that it's overconsumption of calories. Now, if you're somebody who knows that you have a really hard time not overconsuming sugar, or you're somebody who knows that, like, you just, it's easier for you. We always, like, everything is restriction in terms of, like, what you prefer. Let me explain. So, for some people, for me, it feels more restrictive on my lifestyle if I can't eat carbohydrate as a food group, or if I can't eat for 16 hours, or if I can't. So I'm never saying any of these things don't work. They absolutely do work for people. For me, the least restriction I feel is when I can track and eat the foods that I enjoy, and kind of fit that into my macros, for lack of a better term, flexible dieting. But somebody may feel extremely restricted by having to track, right? Like that may actually feel like more restriction to them. And so for them, they say, you know what, like it's just so burdensome on my lifestyle. It activates my OCD. So for me, like I just, if I don't eat for 16 hours, I know I won't overeat in 8 hours, and that's how I create my caloric deficit. Do that, 100%. Same thing for ketogenic diet. If that's how you're able to create a calorie deficit, and that's what makes sense for you and your lifestyle, and you're able to maintain that, I'm 100% all behind that. And here's where the caveat for me comes in. Just don't tell me it's better in terms of physiologically better, when the research says otherwise, right? I think what we have a lot of times is, it's so weird in nutrition. People will figure out what they like to do, and then they'll try to take the research and validate what they like to do using the research and cherry picking, right?
Cherry picking.
Instead of, why can't you just say, well, what it comes down to is basically calories consumed, somewhat protein, because protein and fiber because they're thermogenic, and everything else is kind of, just kind of do what you prefer. Why can't we just say that? What's wrong with that? And I think for whatever reason, it's because nutrition has become kind of this religious cult. I mean, you mentioned yesterday that somebody said yesterday, or not yesterday, but he mentioned yesterday that people who were like ketogenic diet followers accused him of not actually following ketogenic diet principles because he said calories matter.
You'd be surprised at how many times, I'm told by people online who dub themselves nutrition experts that when you do keto, calories don't matter anymore. And I don't know where they get this from, but another important point to bring up alongside what you said, Layne, is that, a lot of people get to thinking that because one nutrition method works well for them, it must work well for everybody else. Therefore, they have to, it's their mission in life to convince everybody else the same exact thing.
We must convert you or we will launch the jihad. Like that's what it feels like sometimes, like, because I put out a video, well, actually, the way we met, we talked about this. So the way Sohi and I met was she wanted a quote for an article she was doing on intermittent fasting.
And
5 years actually, ago. You tell the story.
Yes. Okay. So it was June or July of 2012. I had just graduated from undergrad. I was interning at a place in the Boston area at a strength training facility, and I was just had started blogging a few months by then, and that was when intermittent fasting had just started blowing up, 5 and a bit years ago. And I was writing a blog post on not attacking it, not supporting it. It was just a post to help you to whether or not fasting, you should do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it right for you?
Yeah, is it right for you? Here's a list to determine. And I reached out to Layne to get a quote because I knew from following him on Twitter and other Facebook and things like that he had some thoughts on intermittent fasting. And I think within an hour or so, you replied back to me. This is with a paragraph long quote. He goes, "Is this okay?" And I'm like, "Oh my God, yes!" So I plugged it in, and a few days later, I published the article, and I got shared quite a bit, making a lot of intermittent fasters very angry because they obviously misinterpreted what I was saying.
The high priest in particular.
Oh yeah, Martin Birkin.
Calls himself the high priest of intermittent fasting.
Oh really?
I find it funny. Yeah. Which is actually very funny considering it's like a religious cult that he calls himself the high priest. I thought that was pretty fitting.
Well, so it's funny now because it got a lot of shares and it got a lot of discussion going and made a lot of people angry. But it's funny because people thought I was anti-intermittent fasting, but I'm like, even now I'm like, I actually do intermittent fasting. I just don't stuff it down people's throats just because I do it and it works for me.
Tools and as a coach, I think you can talk about this. So you and I can speak to this. Is that everything's tools in a tool belt, right? Yeah. I've never told somebody, hey, you can't do intermittent fasting if you're working with me. What I tell them is, okay, well, as long as you understand that you enjoy it, so that's good, that's important. Yeah. There's this drawback to it, but as long as you're okay with that, then sure, do that. That's fine. Like, why can't we just do, libertarian Layne here? Why can't you just leave people alone to do what they like to do? Like this, if it at the end of the day, if it works for them, that's fine. Even like reverse dieting, people get so mad about my stuff with reverse dieting, and I'm like, I'm not telling anybody that this is like the magic solution. I'm not stuffing it down your throat. All I'm saying is this is an option. If you want to do it, great. If you don't, then no skin off my back. You know what I mean? But yeah, so it's kind of interesting how you've even dealt with, Yeah. But I bet, it's kind of like vegans. I got this after I did a kind of a review of What the Health.
I still haven't seen that movie yet. I can't bring myself.
Maybe not to. I haven't seen it either.
I have PTSD.
I should watch it though, because I get a lot of emails.
I have PTSD from that documentary. The vegans who were actually like intelligent and could listen to what I was saying said, "Oh, thank you so much." Like, well, I get so tired of having to deal with, the zealot vegans, and they said that they feel like they make vegans look bad. It's no different. Unfortunately, it's like the loud minority. You know what I mean? It's no different than, again, by relating to religion. There are plenty of Muslims who are great people and lovely people, and most of them are. But unfortunately, when some crazy goes and bombs someplace, we get a negative opinion of a group of people who don't deserve that negative opinion, right? And it's the same thing for any stereotype. But yeah, like the whole joke, a CrossFitter, somebody else walk into a bar, you know what I mean, or who tells who about what first, and I think most people are kind of more along the lines of they just stay quiet because they don't want to get involved in, well, I'm right, well, you're wrong, well, and and really, if it works for somebody, who cares? And I will say, like, I got to kind of that point a little bit with flexible dieting. Like, I don't want to say I shoved it down people's throats, but I probably got too overzealous with my promotion of it, and so I've kind of come back on that now, and
So you're a flexible dieting zealot.
Yeah. I was out there carrying the flag into battle, a big old Pop-Tart on the flag. So.
And then you have people being like, I don't like Pop-Tarts though.
Yeah, I actually don't even like Pop-Tarts.
I don't either. I'm like, you don't have to eat Pop-Tarts.
So let's bring this back just a little bit. But it was great to hear you say that, because it's people will look at us, and I've had people, well, how can you be friends with Dom? Like, he's a ketogenic diet person, this and that. I'm like, well, have you ever talked to him? Have you ever actually listened to what he says? It was like I put up something on Twitter in terms of what you say and what people hear, right? So I put something up on Twitter, and I said, a study that showed that there was no metabolic advantage to ketogenic diets, that there was, between that and calorie equated, that it was clear. The same. Yeah. And somebody said, well, that's not true. I lost 50 pounds on a ketogenic diet. I said, did you read? Yeah. Did you actually read? Well, for those of you that can't see, Dom has just implied facepalm very hard. So, yeah, I mean, it's just like, really, did you read what I actually said?
Maybe the definition of metabolic advantage can be misinterpreted, I think.
Well, I think when people say you don't say it's the greatest thing ever, I think the immediate response is you're saying it doesn't work. Yeah. And that's not true.
I would say it has an appetite suppressant advantage. So, and that could be a little bit debated, but I think when you have, reduced fluctuations in glucose and fluctuations in insulin and things like that, that over time that you won't have intense cravings, like everything's sort of attenuated. And I remember, when I was pretty low, very low fat, high to moderate carb, moderate protein, that I had pretty intense cravings, in between meals, and that just doesn't happen anymore. So that's a practical thing that I think helps a lot of people. And when they experience that, that can actually make them a zealot because they've tried other methods and say that it just doesn't work, but they probably haven't given flexible dieting a try, and in a structured approach. And maybe looking back at how I kind of approached it when I was doing, I guess maybe more of a flexible dieting or counting macros, I felt like I was preoccupied with food, especially eating 4 to 6 to sometimes 8 meals a day, which I needed to kind of maintain my energy. And now, I could go, all the entire day and not eat, and then maintain, my work on a grant or work in the lab, and stopping to eat, make food, prepare food, clean up. That's a non-issue if that happens. It might not be ideal for for physique alteration, but I do that from time to time, and it doesn't bother me.
So you had a sorry. So
really quick question, and then I had an actual real question. Do you ever miss things like French fries? Pasta.
You know what? Yeah. So there are some foods, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday. The foods that I kind of miss, I guess probably fruit would be the big one. But like last night, I had my wife and I split a pomegranate, right? So I cut that, and maybe I had a quarter because we split a half, and I had that, and that satisfied my craving for fruit. But I have dark chocolate every day. I make a ketogenic ice cream that's pretty good, and companies that are emerging on the market now that are keto and super low carb foods. So I have ketogenic cookies, ketogenic brownies, ketogenic muffins, and things like that. So all these foods that were quote unquote comfort foods, and even dark chocolate that has stevia and a little bit of erythritol in it, and it's I can eat pretty large chunk of a bar and stay in ketosis with it. So now there really doesn't exist any foods that I crave. And you mentioned French fries. I grew up eating potatoes, working on a potato farm. I loved it. But now,
of course you did.
I do make cauliflower mashed potatoes, which is you overcook it, throw in lots of butter and a food processor, and you would be hard pressed, if it's done right, hard pressed to distinguish between mashed potatoes and cauliflower mashed potatoes. I actually like the cauliflower ones because it's more rich and buttery. So you just have to be a little bit creative, and therefore I don't really view it as restrictive. I did until some of these foods came on the market, and now you learn how to cook foods in different ways, to meet those cravings that you have.
I think that psychological distinction is really important, especially with what I'm interested in too. I think about this stuff a lot when people decide to go adopt the keto diet, for example. It works really great for a lot of people, and for me, I suspect that it has a lot to do with choosing not to eat certain foods or food groups because you decide on your own that is not what makes you feel your best, perform your best, versus being told that you're not allowed to eat it just because some coach tells you so. So there's a that distinction between I am not allowed to eat this or that's a bad food versus I choose not to eat it, I think has a lot of implications for how sustainable a given diet is, how much you enjoy it, how psychologically deprived you do or do not feel, which I think is a huge, we don't talk about that part enough, I don't think.
Yeah, that is important.
Yeah. Okay, and so I know we talked about keto for body comp and weight loss, and we decided that it can work great for a lot of people, but it's not a magic solution. You still need to create a caloric deficit to lose body fat. For what population would you very strongly recommend keto for its health benefits? Because I know you talked about cancer and things like that. So what are the populations do you think it works well?
Well, I would, the person has to be pretty motivated to do it, right? So I would kind of select based on that. So I think when we're younger, I would pretty much exclude the quote unquote young population, like someone in their early 20s. Like you wouldn't want to put a teenager on a ketogenic diet unless they had epilepsy or something like that. I'm just looking back, when I played football, there was no way I could get in enough calories, or have, there's no way I could do intermittent fasting and gain weight or even maintain weight. So some things work for others. But as we age, our carbohydrate tolerance decreases with age. And I think that's pretty clear. just from what I've seen in numbers, if you track people's numbers kind of over time. So I think, generally speaking, I would say the middle-aged population, people over 50, may be more responsive to the health benefits, and that's also when we have to start thinking a little bit more about prevention and longevity, I think, and things like chronic inflammation just start creeping in. I mean, when I turned 40, and now approaching into my mid-40s, I felt a little bit more achy if I get off of the ketogenic diet, and then when I get back on, it seems to like I'm taking Motrin or something, like the inflammation goes away. So that's a real benefit that I knew happened, and now we know that research has shown that beta hydroxybutyrate inhibits the NLRP3 inflammasome. So it's a major kind of complex that when it's suppressed, it prevents inflammatory cytokines from being activated. And these things are associated with age-related chronic diseases, autoimmune diseases. So it's suppressing a major activator of inflammation, just keeping beta hydroxybutyrate levels elevated to a fairly mild amount, like 1 millimolar, has an anti-inflammatory effect. So, and of course, people that maybe have cancer in their family may benefit from simple carbohydrate restriction. So people who have hyperglycemia, people who have maybe chronic inflammation or are predisposition for things like Alzheimer's disease, if they're ApoE4 positive. So that would be sort of the genetic, gives you a genetic predisposition for Alzheimer's disease. So I think my opinion is that, and I think maybe the research supports this too, is that if you lower things like hemoglobin H1C, you keep that lower, you keep CRP lower, which is a marker of inflammation, which these things have gone down in me when I follow the ketogenic diet, and I'm a normal, healthy person. They weren't elevated really to begin with, but my CRP was like 1.5, and now it hardly gets above 0.3. So keeping chronically like lower levels of inflammation, preventing systemic inflammation. Acute inflammation can be a good thing. It can be kind of an activator of muscle growth and things like that, and your body's adaptation to that inflammation is important. So that doesn't go away, but that chronic low level of inflammation can be damaging to the cells, and studies have shown that can induce genes that can cause cancer, oncogenes. So go ahead.
Something interesting I was going to point out that a lot of scientists even don't get that, like the difference between a short-term truncated response versus a long-term low-level elevation. There's a huge difference. Like even if you just look at the inflammation, reactive oxygen species, hormones, all those sorts of things, right? Look at like testosterone goes up after when you work out. That's a fuel.
Cortisol too.
Cortisol too. That's a fuel response. That's not that's not the anabolic mechanism, and they've shown this. They've actually disproven the idea that the short-term rises and falls of testosterone and GH are what cause these things. It's your chronic levels of testosterone that's going to change hypertrophy. Same thing for inflammation, right? So you have an inflammatory response when you train, or you get an injury, you get sick, right? And that's part of a normal, healthy thing that probably should happen.
Promotes healing and repair.
That's
healing and repair would be significantly attenuated.
Unfortunately, people hear inflammation and they say that's bad, right? And the fact of the matter is, these systems are in your body for a reason, right? Like if you didn't have an inflammatory system, you couldn't repair tissue. Like you would not be able to repair tissue. You would just die from a cut. You know what I mean? So you have to have those systems in place. Now, what happens is, like Dom said, when a system becomes dysregulated and it's chronically, just like, basically what kills cancer are things that activate apoptosis, right? Cell death. You wouldn't want cell death to get out of control, right? Just like you don't want cell growth to get out of control. So normal systems that are put in place in the body, and if you've ever had a biochemistry class, you actually I walked out going, man, it's amazing shit doesn't go wrong more often. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Because you just look at what happens if you mess up one kinase or enzyme or something
Yeah,
like that,
yeah.
and you can just have huge repercussions. And for the most part, the body is really resilient.
Yeah.
In fact, what you find is that for you to actually be sick, I'll take kidneys for instance. You can operate on like 20% of one kidney essentially. So for you actually to start to get sick, like you're in a pretty bad spot. The same thing, like by the time you've actually forced type 2 diabetes onto yourself, you're in a really bad metabolic spot.
Yeah.
Because your body has so many redundant systems to try to prevent that from happening.
Yeah.
Or cancer. There's all kinds of things that are in place to prevent uncontrolled cell growth.
Yeah.
So you're going to need some kind of extreme response,
Yeah.
like so a ketogenic diet, like in terms of dietary intervention, is a pretty extreme dietary intervention. I mean, would you think I'm going over the line?
It puts stress on your body
too.
But I think, when people's metabolic health is not in check and they're insulin resistant and hyperglycemic, and you find that often correlates with elevated levels of inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein. So your body is kind of working. Your body's less vigilant, I would say. When you're in those states, your immune system is less vigilant in finding and purging out and killing the cancer cells or precancer cells that could be coming about, right? So I think when it's been shown by my colleague, Dr. Adrian Scheck, at Barrow Neurological Institute, and even by guys like Walter Longo, that fasting can activate the immune system and make it more vigilant in a way, and stimulates autophagy in precancer cells or even cancer cells. It puts metabolic stress on them and kind of activates the immune system in a way to seek out, find, identify, and neutralize and kill cells that are transformed from normal cells to precancerous or cancer cells. So that's really interesting to me, and I think that's some of the benefits that people. You asked me about, who could benefit from the ketogenic diet. I do think that periodic, intermittent fasting, or even what I would call intermittent ketosis, periodically going into a state of nutritional ketosis, can be beneficial for those reasons.
Is this something you'd also recommend to maybe not?
Would you call it like a detox, maybe?
Well, you know what?
Wait, keto, paleo,
oh gosh,
backloading,
yeah, I combine them all.
Keto detox. It's done.
So
we're gonna make billions, Dom.
I really do hate the detox because it gets overused. But I think if there is one kind of thing that we could do to detox our body, it would be not eating and drinking like water, right? Because our bodies will. Our liver, for example, stores a lot of stuff, and we can go a pretty long time not eating. Actually, the record's about 380 days or more not eating. It's a case report for a guy that was about 500 pounds, and he got down to 190 pounds and maintained it years after. So it's a fascinating case report. I include it in some of my talks usually.
How low did he get?
He was about 500 pounds, and he got down to like 190, 195, and then maintained it. And he had 0 calories. So he had electrolytes at certain points, and so it was over 1 year of not eating. So it's remarkable. So
I bet he got productive as hell.
I was gonna say, and saved a lot of money on not buying.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I do think there's benefits. It can also be people can take it way too far and just kind of get preoccupied with it. But periodically, I will do a short-term fast. I did a 1-week fast just mostly as a self-experiment. And was really surprised at how kind of easy it was after the first couple days. But it's not something that I want to do again, And now I don't even do intermittent fast. I do it once or twice a week, And when I kind of want to be sharp, or I just don't have time to make breakfast, that I do it, and I feel fine. So that's the benefits of it. And I think I feel a little bit better doing intermittent fasting because I follow a ketogenic diet. So when my blood glucose gets low, it doesn't trigger a crisis panic response in my brain,
because you're using a different fuel path.
Exactly.
You're using a different fuel source.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's the difference. Is I guess we should kind of circle back, because ketosis really the reason this happens is for, I would say, essentially two reasons. One, your body is trying to spare blood glucose, so it's going to switch to ketones and fats, and it's doing that to spare glucose, and also to provide a fuel source for your brain, because your brain, if you're allowed to stay in kind of a, I don't want to say glycolytic state, but a non-ketogenic state, and you're on low carbohydrate, your brain's going to run through glucose pretty quick, because your obligate glucose usage is basically just your red blood cells, because they don't have mitochondria, right? Am I missing anything?
A little bit. Your brain really, it can't function off zero glucose, even when
but you
we're
can make
fasting.
100 grams of glucose a day just from your liver.
Very easy. And then, from triglycerides, the glycerol backbone becomes glucose. But I think it's the ketosis, one of the functions is, evolutionary perspective, is to prevent the catabolic breakdown of muscle tissue to get glucose for your brain. So the ketones largely replace, about 70% of that energy is coming from ketones. And if we didn't make ketones, 70% of that energy would be coming from breaking down muscle. And we would go, instead of, a lean person going 2 or 3 months and being okay, a lean person would probably fail to make it more than 2 weeks if they weren't making ketones, because they would break down skeletal muscle and heart muscle and would probably die of a cardiac arrest or something.
So I think one of the things that I would say is that, like, one of the worst places you can be in terms of like fuel selection would be low carb, but so high protein and not high enough fat that you're you're very low carb, but you're not able to actually be in ketosis. If you're like skirting that line, you're better off being in ketosis, or being on a moderate carbohydrate diet where you have both fat and glucose as clear fuel lines to choose from. And then maybe, you could always do a ketone supplement, of course, because we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But let's go, because I think a lot of people are going to want to know about cancer specifically. And I want to give you the chance to kind of clarify, because a lot of people will take your stuff and they'll go way too far in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Is it a cure?
No, definitely not a cure.
And so, number two, so who would it be for? What kind of is it ubiquitous across all cancer cell lines? And how does it actually work? And how would you, in general, recommend implementing it? With somebody who maybe is facing something like that.
Yeah. So that's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So
okay. Let me go back.
No.
How does it work?
How does it work? Well, the reason that it kind of even works at all was, I think it was Linda Nebling, published a paper about 20 years ago or so in kids that had brain tumors. And these kids, also get seizures. So it made sense that, let's use the ketogenic diet here to help not only control some of the seizures that kids were having, but it made sense from a metabolic standpoint that lowering glucose availability, especially in brain tumors that show up hot on a PET scan, and suppressing insulin signaling would, at the very least, slow the tumor growth over time and help these patients maintain their seizures too. So it was like serving two important purposes. And out of those studies evolved, and it was kind of generally appreciated that the ketogenic diet mimicked the many aspects of the metabolic physiology that would occur with calorie restriction and with fasting. So that would be suppression of IGF-1, suppression of mTOR signaling, reduce spikes in glucose and insulin, that sort of thing. So it was appreciated from a biochemical standpoint that it kind of makes sense to do it. And then some animal studies were done, animal experiments were done. It kind of validated it in a number of different models. I know Eugene Fine from Albert Einstein Institute had 7 different aggressive human cancer cell lines, and grew these cancer cell lines, these human cancer cell lines, in the presence of ketones. And I think all 7 human cancer cell lines, from a wide variety of sources, were all inhibited. Their growth was inhibited in one way or another. In some cells it was a mild inhibition, in others it was a relatively significant decrease in the cancer cell's ability to make ATP in the presence of ketones. So I think it seemed like this was a useful application, in particular for brain cancer patients that suffer from seizures. And that's really what I became interested in studying because I was studying seizures at the time. And a few of the colleagues that had patients and a few of the colleagues that were doing animal research casually said to me, well, the ketogenic diet's actually probably more effective for cancer than it is for epilepsy. And they appreciated that the ketogenic diet was effective for epilepsy. So, and I kind of asked, well, why isn't this not being studied? And it was being studied by a few people, but it motivated me more to study this because I wanted to understand if this was actually the case. And I specifically wanted to understand if the ketogenic diet could suppress the growth and spread of a glioblastoma, which is, as we know, the most aggressive forms of cancer. It's a brain cancer. So I tried to get access to a glioblastoma brain cancer model, mouse model, and was diverted to a model system that had been used, and actually chemotherapy was studied with this model. And it was basically, they had not cured cancer in this model yet. So it actually made me more interested in studying it since nothing was working in it. And I was like, well, okay, so let's use this model system. And it was the first model system that we studied in the lab, and it had, the ketogenic diet had a remarkable effect at preventing the spread and growth of metastatic cancer in this particular model. So now, what we're doing is studying a wide array of different types of cancers to determine if other types of cancers are amenable to this kind of therapy. And of course, it's not our lab. People just look at our lab as the only lab studying the ketogenic diet in cancer, but it's really dozens of labs. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov, when I got into this research, there may have been one. I don't even think there was one study, doing this 10 years ago. But now there's maybe approaching 24 studies. Like, these are large-scale clinical trials that are registered, and most of them, we believe that the nutritional ketosis should function as an adjuvant to the standard of care in most cases, right? That it can, and that's what one of my colleagues, Adrian Scheck, studies. The enhancement of chemotherapy and the enhancement of radiation therapy with nutritional ketosis. So it makes the cancer cells more vulnerable to other modalities that you're hitting it with. So basically, if you compromise tumor metabolism, the metabolism of sugar plays a big role in generating various defense systems that the cancer cells use. And you cripple their defenses and you hit it with, various modalities, then you can enhance the therapeutic effect. And patients also get less side effects when they follow the ketogenic diet. This was kind of shown also when they fast. Walter Longo published a few studies showing fasting can prevent some of the side effects. And side effects of inflammation or side effects of chemo and radiation have to do with too much inflammation, like chronic inflammation. So it tends to knock down those aspects of it. So to answer your question, I think that the types of cancer that would be most amenable to this therapy are ones that overtly express what we call the Warburg effect, right? Which is rates of glycolysis many times higher, up to 200 times higher in cancer cells relative to normal healthy cells, that are very apparent and visible on something like an FDG PET scan. So oncologists use this technology to locate, to pinpoint the location of cancer and also the aggressiveness of cancer. But as of now, they don't use that technology or this information, I would say, to target the cancer. Although there's a lot of pharmaceutical companies that are scrambling to basically develop drugs that can inhibit tumor metabolism with specific emphasis on enzymes like hexokinase and hexokinase 2. There's also a recent interest, and this is pretty new, a recent interest that tumor cells can metabolize fatty acids for energy. And that kind of contradicts some of the ideas that we kind of promote, that cancer cells have damaged mitochondria. But it's not very clear that the cancer cells are using these fatty acids for a source of energy. They may be directing fats towards biosynthetic, to the formation of new membrane, to the expanding biomass of the tumor. And we know that glutamine, for example, actually gets incorporated into the membranes. So it's actually converted into a fatty acid, and so cancer cells do that quite well.
There actually is there are cancer treatments that target glutaminase and asparaginase as well. So like trying to target the breakdown, like preventing the breakdown of glutamine and asparagine. As kind of a way to prevent cell turnover. So, and apparently, like you're saying, they're going to membrane, not for energy metabolism.
A lot of glutamine goes into the membrane. It gets ultimately converted through de novo, fatty acid synthesis.
I wonder if has there been any tracer studies done to look at where those fatty acids are going?
A couple colleagues of mine did some studies with labeled glutamine and showed that it was being incorporated, when they do the lipidomics, it was being incorporated into fatty acids. Interestingly, when you follow the ketogenic diet or even carbohydrate, restricted higher fat diet, your blood levels of fats go down, because if you're eating carbohydrates, you're kind of sparing the fats for fuel, so they float around in your blood and could be potentially even feeding these tumors that are thriving off fat. So when you train your body to be more fat adapted, I would say, you tend to, and of course it's dependent on calorie deficit, right? That with the calorie deficit especially, that you actually significantly reduce triglyceride levels in the blood, and that was probably the biggest thing that I saw in my blood work, that my triglyceride levels went down, got cut in half. So I had less fat in my blood, even though I was eating about 3 times more fat.
It has to be your overall cap, because if you're eating, it should be a high fat diet relative to caloric restriction, especially I think if we're talking about cancer. The caloric restriction is still a big deal.
I think I do need to emphasize that I think the major benefits, most benefits from the ketogenic diet as it pertains to cancer would be with a calorie-restricted ketogenic diet, which is difficult and even controversial to implement in cancer patients who have cachexia, muscle wasting, which is why we have even a grant to study muscle wasting, to mitigate muscle wasting associated with cancer. And it's really bad because a lot of people who have cancer are old, so they have age-related sarcopenia on top of cancer cachexia, on top of chemo-induced cachexia. Chemotherapy is very catabolic to muscle, so you have all these different things factoring in. Plus, they don't feel good, so they can't exercise, so they have muscle wasting because they lose their functionality. So
and they have trouble eating, especially like things
on
like
top of that,
higher protein foods and whatnot. They're hard to eat. But I think you look at like if you're talking about not like a 70% fat diet, and you're talking about 2,000 calories, but if you're talking about 4,000 calories, which is there's probably nobody on cancer treatment who's going to eat that much. Maybe there are, but that would be enough fat that even though yes you're metabolizing fat, you're probably going to see your fat go up in your blood just because there's only so much you're going to metabolize. I mean, not to get too far off track, but people ask like what causes type 2 diabetes and everything, and I actually think the mitochondrial dysfunction is kind of the core of it, because if you look at it like a conveyor belt, it's coming out of the blood into the cell where it's being metabolized. If the end point where it's being metabolized, if that kind of slows down, it's going to back everything else up. And what do you see in type 2 diabetes? Well, you not just see elevated blood glucose, you also see elevated blood lipids. You actually see elevated blood amino acids as well. So and actually it was funny, there's a lab that was kind of making the case that branched chain amino acids were the cause of type 2 diabetes, which I thought was interesting. Newgard, and it's like, well, everything's elevated in type 2 diabetes. Do you really think it's of all things the branch chains? But no, so I think that's something I wanted to emphasize. And
surplus calories. So if you're eating the ketogenic diet and you have surplus calories in the form of fat, obviously you're going to have an elevated, fat levels in the blood, and the liver is quite adept at converting excess carbohydrates through de novo lipogenesis into fat, and the fat kind of stays in the liver. So excess carbohydrates can be converted to fat, maybe not as much, as adipose as it stays in the liver. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is something.
So so looking at, and you said that it seemed like the types of cancers who were more aggressive, they
Yeah.
tend to have this Warburg effect,
Yep.
and that they may be more receptive to this treatment,
Yep.
whereas slow-growing cancers, you took the example of
More
testicular cancer.
Indolent cancer, yeah.
Yeah.
Or
But those
or
are usually
blood
very...
cancers, too.
Oh, okay.
Like
No,
leukemia, lymphoma, testicular cancer, maybe like stage 1 or 2 breast cancer even, are, there's a number of types of cancers you'd be crazy not to do the standard of care. It works very well. We would argue, we think that it would work much, much better in many cases if you use the ketogenic diet as an adjuvant approach, because right now, mainstream oncology does not really appreciate that nutrition can have an impact, a significant impact on the quality of life and the outcomes, the survival outcomes of the patient. And, if you just, anyone who studies nutrition and metabolism realize that that's not true, and it's actually really, really unfortunate that it's an underutilized approach. So the whole nutrition, the person has to be, this will play a big role in their ability to tolerate chemotherapy too, their overall metabolic health and physiology. I've seen people succumb to the stress of chemotherapy and die as a result of the chemotherapy.
Yeah, in fact, that's very common. A lot of people die from the treatment, not from the therapy. In fact, you'll have people who have like stage 4 or something like that, and there may be like comorbidities and ill health.
Yeah.
And doctors will go, it's not even worth it to do chemo for them because it's going to kill them.
Oh, yeah.
They might as well try and live the rest of their life comfortably.
Yeah.
Because, dying from chemo is actually a really awful process.
And I've seen it happen in people that were like very robust health and strong, and guys that I trained with a few weeks earlier in the gym, and we were going set for set with one another, and they go in for chemo, and it just completely compromises their immune system, where maybe they have a minor surgical procedure and get an infection, and they basically are killed off by that. So I've seen this happen, and it's pretty sad.
Yeah, and I think the point to make here is you're not saying, and we're not saying, and I don't think anybody reasonable person would ever say, but I have heard this from keto zealots. We're not saying don't get chemo or don't do the standard of care if you have cancer. What
I've actually encouraged people to do. I've had even students of mine get certain forms of cancer where they were saying, well, I'm considering not doing it, and I would actually talk them into doing the standard of care. And maybe encouraging, instead of the maximum tolerable dose, maybe a more moderate or even minimal, effective dose, because a lot of people, oncologists really think that you kind of go in there, cut, and just hit it with the highest dose possible, and then let's see what happens. And I think the chemo is doing a lot of collateral damage, and that needs to be appreciated. So I think it's important to approach therapy in that regard. There's new therapies being developed, like immune-based therapies, and I think that's pretty encouraging.
Well, I think what people don't realize too is we go back to the fundamental of what cancer is. It's uncontrolled cell growth.
Yep.
So the way to beat cancer is to stop cell growth. Yep. To stop cell growth, you have to kill those cells, and you have to prevent new ones from coming. So that means you're taking poison. You're taking something that kills cells.
And reduce the drivers that make that possible.
Right,
so
DNA replication.
The mitogens and the fuel. So the fuel and the anabolic precursors that are contributing to the expanding biomass of the tumor, right? So we know that glucose and glutamine are the two fuels, but it's kind of hard to, because your body,
you're glutamine out of the diet.
Yeah, so there's ways to do that, and
glutamine is actually created by the body endogenously, as is glucose. So.
Yeah. So, but if you can drop it down from, glutamine can be as high as like 1 millimolar, and drop it down to, to half, that can compromise. So tumor cells actually have to keep a certain level of energetic state and proliferation to even maintain their viability, because in a tumor, the cells are actually dying off of necrosis, and it's but they're growing faster than they're dying off. So you'll find lots of necrotic cells in tumor. So the idea is, if you could slow down the proliferation, then the cell death in the tumor, is going to be faster than the cells, that are dividing and reproducing and living.
Unfortunately, that means for the healthy cells, there's also going to be some collateral damage, as you said. So that's where you get the side effects from chemo.
Yeah.
So I mean, it sounds like like, I mean, it makes sense. You would want, when you wage a battle on the battlefield, you don't just say, well, we're attacking from land. You go air, land, sea.
Yeah.
So if you're going to try and beat a tumor, okay, let's limit the fuel that fuels the tumor.
Yep.
Let's kill off those cells that are there,
Mm-hmm.
and then let's stop them from proliferating in the first place, kind of like a multi-headed attack. And that seems to make a lot of sense. Now, when I was here a few years ago, you guys said that you seemed like at first you thought it was about dropping the blood glucose really as low as you could.
Mm-hmm.
And then it seems like you kind of changed that opinion, that maybe it was more about getting the ketones actually elevated. Where are you guys on that?
So we are at the point where, lowering blood glucose is just not feasible, baseline blood glucose. But what you can do is prevent those spikes in glucose. So those spikes, and you can appreciate this, those relative changes in insulin and glucose and insulin play a big role in growth.
Yeah.
Just like, relative changes in branched chain amino acids and leucine.
Your baseline levels of insulin are just keeping the lights on.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So
unless you have type 2 and you're dysregulated.
Yeah, and I've been doing an insulin experiment on myself. With fat, I can keep it in the very low to normal range. I'll talk about that later. But so the ketogenic diet, keeps insulin and glucose very low, and that's a good thing, and elevates ketones, which have certain signaling properties and even an anti-glycolytic effect in and of itself. So these are some of the things that we find are important, and you can kind of look at the glucose ketone index, which is the ratio of glucose over ketones in millimolar, and if you can keep that between 1 and 2, essentially meaning that you get your glucose down to 3 millimolar, and if you can keep it like that and get your ketones from 1 into the 1 to 3 millimolar range, like that is very therapeutic. That has been shown to be very effective for even managing epilepsy. And other things so we do a lot of drug-based research too. So we are looking at drugs that work, through a metabolic mechanism or through metabolic signaling. And some of these drugs include things like metformin. And we know with type 2 diabetics, if they maintain metformin over the course of their treatment, that they could be 60% less likely to get pancreatic cancer. So
and
that's
metformin's
huge.
they've actually shown now, I think it's in rats, right, that it actually extends their life, that metformin actually extends their life.
It is. So it triggers things like, activation of AMP kinase and
SIRT1.
SIRT1 and various signaling that's associated with longevity signaling. And when I got into this, metformin was not something that would be considered an anti-cancer drug, but if you go on clinicaltrials.gov and type in metformin and cancer, you get about 180 clinical trials. So oncologists see the ketogenic diet and then they see metformin and they're like, why don't we just use metformin? Because it's kind of doing the same thing. But what I say, well, why don't you use the ketogenic diet and metformin and intermittent fasting and, some other things that we do, as I mentioned it earlier, there's things like hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which stimulates oxidative stress in cancer cells. So, and radiation kills cancer cells through stimulating oxidative stress, so generating oxygen-free radicals in the tumor, and the efficacy of radiation therapy will be proportional to the PO2 of the tumor, right? So if you hyperoxygenate a tumor or increase oxidative stress in the tumor and then zap it with radiation, you're going to be, killing off a lot more cells. And hyperbaric oxygen therapy is non-toxic relative to radiation therapy. And also one of my students is studying intravenous vitamin C. So taking oral vitamin C will do nothing. So you just cannot, but certain things delivered intravenously, like vitamin C, can have very potent effects. I mean, you get like millimolar levels of vitamin C.
Wow. So that would be very high levels of oxidative stress.
Yes.
Because any antioxidant, if you get high enough, will become a pro-oxidant.
Not any, if it was vitamin C especially.
Well, vitamin C, yeah.
So it drives what's called the Fenton reaction. So if you go back to biochemistry, so if you create, you can create oxidative stress in the cancer cells, in particular through the generation of oxygen-free radicals, hydrogen peroxide, and through the Fenton reaction, which is driven by free iron. you generate something called the hydroxyl radical, which is very, very potent oxidative stress. And it happens much more readily in cancer cells that have this various breakdown products of heme and heme protein. So the free iron comes from various cytochromes and heme proteins. So you have a lot of free iron in the tumor. And if you saturate your body with high levels of vitamin C in addition to hyperbaric oxygen therapy, you are selectively generating proportionally way more oxidative stress in the tumor cells relative to the healthy tissue. And if you think about it, hyperbaric oxygen therapy and vitamin C are completely non-toxic, or they can be delivered in a way that's completely non-toxic. We know how to do that. So these are some of the approaches that we think should be tried in some patients even before the standard of care. So that could be kind of controversial, but these are approaches that we believe, should be used perhaps as a neoadjuvant and also as an adjuvant to the standard of care.
And one more thing, because I know you've got probably a ton of questions. So but you also do actually exogenous ketones. Right?
Yes.
You guys use that as well.
So that's I don't want to be like the exogenous ketone shilling guy. But yeah, we are, and the science is emerging on this, but it is showing that if you can sort of artificially elevate ketone levels with a ketone ester, which was developed originally for more military applications, or a ketone salt, which is taking the ketone body, beta hydroxybutyrate, and combining it with like sodium, potassium, magnesium, things like that. That we can artificially, elevate ketosis to a level even within 15 to 20 minutes to a level that would take like a week to achieve with a diet or fasting. So we can deliver these things in pretty high doses.
Well, that could be useful for somebody who's following a ketogenic diet, and for whatever reason, like they decide, I want to have some carbohydrate today, but they want to stay in ketosis.
Yeah.
That would keep them in. Am I thinking about this correctly? Like, would that keep them in ketosis?
It would keep them in ketosis, and I think, the benefits are, they would be getting, the benefits of having ketones elevated, which we now know are, reduction in inflammation and even a gene activation that can have epigenetic effects. And there's various, things that have been studied in animal models, at least. But also, from a dieting perspective, is that if you do take in carbohydrates, that we have shown and other labs have shown that when you consume ketones with carbohydrates, you have better glucose disposal in your body. So it's in some ways, we don't understand this yet, but it's very clear it's happening with ketone salts and with ketone esters, that it's decreasing the blood glucose levels when you consume exogenous ketones.
That almost seems counterintuitive.
It's a really big effect. It's not like something that's small. Like, we do research with metformin, and it's like way more potent than metformin in suppressing glucose levels.
Yeah, and the thing to keep in mind is you may be getting an improvement in insulin sensitivity, which maybe could explain it.
Yeah.
This information is, to me, a lot of new information, and you would think that a lot more people would be making a bigger deal about this, and kind of makes me think that maybe we need to do a better job of disseminating this information, especially with cancer and all these things. So I had a question from way back then. The beginning of the episode, you mentioned that a lot of people think that keto is just high protein, but you mentioned moderate protein. So what? Yeah. And it's not never eat any carbs ever, because you eat, you had pomegranate and whatnot. What qualifies to you? I know obviously needs will differ based on the person's size, body weight, etc. What qualifies as keto in terms of protein, carbs, and fats?
Yeah, moderate protein would be 1 gram to 1.5 grams per kilogram of protein. Okay. So for me, I'm 100 kilograms, so that would be 100 to 150 grams a day of protein would be moderate. And when you maintain that level of protein, with balance being fats, you can that macronutrient profile would achieve and sustain nutritional ketosis through the suppression of insulin signaling, enhance fat oxidation in the liver and the generation of de novo ketones, ketogenesis. So that can be maintained with that macronutrient profile. So it's really important. If you get above that, the excess protein can stimulate insulin response and keep you out of nutritional ketosis.
Which is actually, I think, it's probably lower than what most bodybuilders eat for protein-wise anyway. It's probably lower than what most bodybuilders consume lately because they usually do 1 gram per pound of body weight or more is what I've seen with bodybuilders. So maybe bring that down if they want to.
Yeah, it would be, the most you'd want to go would be like 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kg, I think, per kilo. Yeah.
I did 400 grams of protein for years, and it was just kind of unnecessary. Yeah, so I did that. So now I realize it's amazing. I eat probably like a third of the amount of protein that I used to eat and can maintain the same strength, if I keep my calories regulated. So. Yeah.
Well, Dom, we could probably sit here and talk for another 3 hours, but
easily,
where can people find out more about you and your research?
The best site to catch me on is ketonutrition.org. So that site has clinical trials. It has a list of consultants on there that do diet consulting for performance or for clinical things, and it's got a wide range of resources that I think would help people that are interested in the topics we talked about today.
Awesome. Well, and you can find Sohi at sohifit.com, myself at biolayne.com. I hope you guys enjoyed this. This has been a podcast long time coming because I've known Don for so long. I'm sure this won't be the last one. I think, Sohi, you really enjoyed this one, right?
I learned so much.
You stand around Dom, Holly, and Kabir were here yesterday, and they're both just mind blown, and I was getting the itch to go back to school.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Dom.
Your time.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. So we'll catch you later.
All right. Bye.
Bye, Zoe.